Imagine you are given this dataset to come out with insights from this dataset. This is, we have the dataset here, and you have a lot of columns, about from column A to column N, and you are supposed to come up with some insights out of the data. What is the quickest way or the easiest way to go about this? One of the easiest ways to achieve this is to use pivot tables, and pivot tables are one of the powerful tools you can find in Excel for some basic analysis, right? So let's look at why you need a pivot table and also when you need to use a pivot table. So as I indicated earlier, when you are given certain KPIs to come up with insights or to get some insights from a particular data set you have, then you can leverage on pivot tables to get it faster or quicker instead of doing it manually or trying to leverage on certain formulas to achieve that. Pivot table automate the whole process for you, right? Anyway, there's some other advanced automations in Excel, but with pivot table, you don't need to necessarily create a formula for sum, for average, for max. You don't need to do that. With pivot tables, you can do all those things easily, right? So, and why do you need a pivot table? So, with pivot table, you can also organize your data, get some summaries out of it, do some analysis on your data. So that is why you also need a pivot table. All right. So in order to create a pivot table, you also need to look at the structure of the data, right? So if you can observe with my data I have here, it's all structured in a table form. You can also get a data that is not structured like mine. And before you do that, you can put it nicely in a structure or structured manner. So for this, I can just paste as values. This is how it is. Even though this is not in a table form, I can still get pivot table out of this particular data. Right. This is just a copy of the data sets. So I just copied and pasted as values. Okay, so you need to first look at the structure of your data. You know unnecessary formatting in your table in your data. Then we can use that. Okay, so let's look at how we can actually create a pivot table in Excel. All right, so let me, because mine is formatted, I can create a pivot table easily out of this data. And one thing I also recommend is that once you have formatted your table or your data as a table, you need to rename your table. So here, instead of table one, I've renamed mine to dataset. By default, it starts with table one to table, let's say n, right? So if this is table one, this would have been table two, but I've also renamed this one, this product table. I've renamed as products. Okay, so if this particular copy I made, if I convert this to a table by just pressing Control T, Control T, converted as a table, you see by default is having a name table 6. So this, I need to convert or rename this to the proper name that I want to give to the data. If I decide to call this maybe dataset 2, I can name this one as dataset 2 instead of table 6. So that's a bit descriptive of the data I have in there. Okay, so let's convert this one back to range. Okay, I don't need this one to be in a table format, so convert back to range. Okay, so let's see what. Anyway, it's converted back as range, but it maintained the formatting, which is fine. It's not a big deal. It maintained the formatting. But to know that whether it's a table, when you look up here, you should see table design here. then it tells you that the data you have is actually a table. But in this case, even though I've converted back to range, it maintained its formatting, but you can't see the table design tab up there. So it's still a normal range data you have here. Okay, so and when it comes to inserting or creating the pivot table, you can actually use base you create based on the the range or the data range you have, or you can create based on a table. But I prefer to always convert my data to a table, then I create my pivot tables. But first of all, let's start from here. So here I can decide to control A, okay, control A and select every data range I have here. Then once it's selected, I can go to insert from table or range. So because I've selected, it's able to select from the column A, column A to column N, and the last row in column N is which was 29,000. You have 29,972 rows. Okay, so that is the very last row. And the first row is A1, right? So it's able to know the range of the data you've selected. So I don't have an existing sheet, so I can create the pivot table in a new sheet. Okay, so now let me press OK, and now you have our pivot table created, but if not, so let me create a space after this. Okay, you have a pivot table created and we have the fields here. So that is the columns you have in our data. And we have the field list. So we can add a filter, we can arrange a table or pivot table data as in columns. You can also have it in rows. Then under the values, we always put numerical items. And if you can also decide to put a categorical item, like let's say product ID, let's say states, you can put them here, but those ones will be counted instead of summarize or let's say finding an average because it's not a number. Okay, so anyway, so when you create a pivot table, this is the interface you see. And one thing you have to observe is that when you click on the pivot table, you should see pivot table analyze and also the design tab here. But if you click outside of it, you realize that those tabs are missing. And sometimes you might get confused. You don't know what is going on. You have it pivot table, but you can't find the field list to maybe bring in a data into your pivots. All you have to do is to click back on the pivot table you've created, and you see all your field lists here. Let's drop some columns into the rows. So I'll drop the brand, the product brand. So let me see the quantity that's were bought for each of these brands. Okay, so these are the various quantities that were bought for each of these brands. Okay, so it tells you I think the highest. So here you can sort it, right? You can sort from largest to smallest. Right, so the highest was the Microsoft, followed by the rest. So that is it about pivot table, how you can create a pivot table. This one was done through a normal range data you have. Okay, but then what if I want to construct the pivot table out of the table you have here? Okay, so all I can do is to go to insert and from table range again. From table range, it automatically knows that our table is called datasets. Right, so it picks that, and now I already have a sheet that contains a pivot table already. So I'll go to existing worksheet instead of new. So I'll come here and I can decide to place this here. Okay, decide to place it there. So I have another pivot table here, and I can also decide to get the same insights I had from this from when I use the range data. So here, drop in the brand to the rows, and I will now drop in the quantity, and you see you have the same grand total. So it's telling you that you have the same results with the different approaches we used. Okay, so that is how you can create a pivot table this basic way. In the next video, you look at how you can add more data into the various field list, and also how you can style our pivot tables.